going to try to share my screen, and this should work. Let me know. Slideshow, and oops, let's just go back. Okay, there we are at the beginning. Are you seeing that front slide? And the
Yes,
slide map. This is a recap from last week.
yes.
Okay, hello everyone. Glad to be back. We're going to really gobble down a lot more history this week. As Cheryl mentioned, it's the long Middle Ages. Some would say the Middle Ages for Jews don't even end with the institution of the ghettos in the 16th century, but continue well into the late 18th century in emancipation. And we'll address that question next week. But today we're going to cover that area that is probably the least known in Jewish history overall, and certainly the least known when it comes to the city of Rome. The period between antiquity, which has been studied forever, even the Jewish aspect. There must be a dozen books on the Jews of ancient Rome, if not the city, at least the empire. And then the period of the ghetto, which has also been the subject of a lot of excellent scholarship in recent decades, but even going back to Ferdinand Gregorovius writing about it in the 19th century. So we have this period of a long span of time, but with less, a comprehensive survey to turn to. I'm pulling pieces from a lot of different places, and I'm going to try to give you some kind of narrative, even though at some points it may seem a little unconnected, because the problem with all medieval history, not just Jewish history, is we pick and choose. We have to pick and choose based on the sources that come down to us. And when we're dealing with the physical city of Rome, because the city has been continuously occupied for millennia, so many of the older remnants, the physical remnants, have been lost or buried, and come to us, if they come to us at all, in a very fragmentary form. Still, I think we can pull a lot together, and let's take a look at this and give it a try. Last week, we talked about Jews in the ancient city, and mostly when we were talking about the physical remains, and because most of our documentary remains are the inscriptions from the Jewish catacombs, the physical remains and the written remains coincide. They all came from the periphery of the city because Jews had to be buried, like all people in ancient Rome, outside of the boundaries, outside of the wall. And we looked at this map, and we looked at these locations of the catacombs. I mentioned that the Jewish catacombs weren't rediscovered until 1602. So the whole period that we are dealing with today, for the most part, these catacombs were probably unknown to the Jewish and the Christian population of Rome. They had been closed and covered, and other cemeteries were created, and sort of new boundaries, new areas of community were the norm. We also ended on this slide of the recently discovered mikveh from Asia Antica, again, outside of the city of Rome, but connected to the city. It's at the mouth of the Tiber. This was the port of Rome. And we know from these archaeological excavations in recent years, Michael White's re-excavation of the synagogue at Ostia, and then these new excavations at the Domos near the theater, that Jews seem to have been active in the city well into the 5th century. That's the 400s. There was a big earthquake in 443, but Jews and Christians still seem to be living in the city after that. And this mikveh and some of the changes in the synagogue are evident of that. So in the city of Rome, we have something similar. It seems we are now in a period of transition where a pagan city is becoming Christianized. This was true because Constantine in the early 300s made Christianity the official state religion, but Rome was the last place really to fully concede its pagan history, because it was the capital of the empire. It was the place where the gods were strongest. And so paganism as a movement, and tied in with traditionalism, classicism, patriotism, and a lot of other isms, really continued to coexist along with the new Christian society that was being founded in the city. And wedged in there with Christianity and with paganism, there was a Jewish community and there was a Jewish tradition. And for the most part, it seems in the fourth and the fifth centuries, there was a fairly uh, tenable coexistence between these religions. The tensions came not so much between in the religious strife, but in the political strife. And in the sixth century, particularly, there's a whole series of wars that really, and there's plague, and there are other kinds of disasters that upset the stability of the whole Italian peninsula. And that's where things are falling apart there, not because of any wars of religion. But when we come out of that, we pass out of that into the late 500s or so, early 600s, and that's the period of the great Pope Gregory the Great. We find that the popes are on top in the ascendancy in Rome, not just as spiritual, but also temporal rulers. And Christianity is certainly dominant by that period too. But Jews are still there. Jews are still there, and we'll see how we know that. So Jews are there as people, as a society, but increasingly, and this is something we're going to see as we move through the centuries, even though they are there physically coexisting with their Christian neighbors, at least officially, they're not seen. They're seen less and less in the reality of the everyday, but they are seen rather as a reflection of the Jews that are represented in the Hebrew Bible. So they're not being real people, they're being symbols of something else. And we see this in many ways. We see it in art, where themes from the Hebrew Bible, from Jewish tradition, are very important in the early centuries of the church as it established its legitimacy. It sees itself very much as the heir, as a continuation of Judaism, but as a religion that has superseded the old law with the new. But to make that point, they are really teaching the stories, the narratives from the Tanakh, from the books of Moses, and also from Judges and from Book of Kings and Chronicles and other historical texts in the Hebrew Bible. So we get a lot of images in churches of characters that I'm assuming most of the audience is Jewish, so we as Jews are familiar with through our own religious education. I show you here a prime example of that, just one of 43 mosaics that were created in the mid-5th century in the great Church of Santa Maria Maggiore on the Esquiline Hill in Rome. And this is a scene recognizable, I think, to all of you, of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. This is the narrative for Passover. Moses, as a young man, not the one we come to expect down here, clean shaven, but with his rod, the sea is split and the Egyptian army is drowning. We have scenes of the life of Abraham. We have scenes of the life of Moses. We have scenes from the prophets, from Joshua, the life of Joshua, decorating this upper register of this very, very important church. And they culminate, of course, with Christian iconography in what's called the Triumphal Arch and the apse, but they're still playing a very dominant role, a very important role in the aesthetic and in the educational, we can say the dogmatic program of the church. This is something that will continue for some time, but it will peter out as the centuries progress, as the church itself distances itself more and more from Judaism and finds it less necessary to keep up those ties. It's already established dominance. It doesn't have to talk about, it doesn't have to justify its legitimacy. And also, as the Christian experience expands, so too do Christian narratives, and Christians are able to fill their churches with saints' lives more and more. There's more and more hagiographic writing, the writing of saints' lives, and stories can be taken from these narratives rather than dipping back into the Hebrew Bible for the best action heroes. Because really, the representations of the Jewish heroes, whether it's Samson, whether it's Moses, whether it's David, whether it's Saul or Solomon, these are the action heroes. These are the superheroes of the fourth, fifth, sixth century. If there was a Marvel movie studio, the equivalent, that would be the these would be the characters that really drew the most enthusiasm. So just some details. These mosaics are written about a lot in the history of art, not so much though for the content, but because of the style of the mosaics. They are evidence that in the 5th century, Roman artists are remarkably accomplished, and they're still maintaining many of the classical techniques in mosaic and in painting that we know going back to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries. If you've been to Pompeii or you've seen some of the work in the museums in Rome, you'll be familiar with that. We're not going to dwell on that now, but these are well worth the time to investigate all these mosaics. Now, we have a very different approach in an almost contemporary church in Rome, Santa Sabina on the Aventine Hill. This was not built by a pope like Santa Maria Maggiore. It was built by a very rich Christian, a man named Peter from Illyricum, in the 420s probably. This is the big dedicatory inscription, but it is the inscription's flanked by 2 images of very severe women dressed in very rich robes, because they're purple robes, and purple is the color of royalty, it's the imperial color. But one of them is designated the ecclesia, the Church of the Circumcised, which refers to the Jews, the synagogue, ecclesia circumcisione, and the other is the woman here on the right. That's the ecclesia of the Gentiles, the Church of the Gentiles. So they're the ones that St. Paul preaches to. And in early Christian art in Rome, we do have a distinction between Peter, who's the sort of Jewish apostle, and Paul, who of course was Jewish, Saul of Tarsus, but he preaches to the Gentiles, as emblematic of this split. But here in the 5th century, we're having allegorical figures, always female figures. Same thing with charity, justice, all the greats are always women. But here we have a synagogue and church. Now, this theme, some of you may be very familiar with much later on in the Middle Ages. It becomes very common in the 12th, 13th, even 14th century, where we get this contrast between ecclesia as the victorious church and synagoga as the defeated synagogue of the Church of the Jews. And essentially, it's a culmination of the development of this millennium, which we'll touch on. But some of you may be familiar with this scene, and this is the front of Notre Dame in Paris. I took this photograph before the fire, but this facade was not destroyed in the fire. And on the left, you have ecclesia, the church, and on the right, I have to move this because I'm seeing all of your faces and not the image. On the right, we have a synagogue over here. She's looking down. She's wearing a little funny hat that the Jews were supposed to wear, and she has a staff that's been broken. So she's beautiful and regal, but she's dejected and defeated, whereas ecclesia over here, carrying her staff with the cross, and she has a crown, is victorious. Essentially, almost 1,000 years separate these two works at Santa Sabina and Notre Dame, but the church philosophy is much the same. Now, we looked at this slide last week. This is a fresco from the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua in the Roman Forum at the base of the Palatine. It was a very important church for the rulers of Rome, the Byzantine rulers in Rome in the early centuries of the Christian city. And again, here too, this harks back to a Jewish story or the Jewish history. It's a narrative from the Book of Maccabees about a family that is martyred. This type of association, but it's actually what today we would call cultural appropriation, this taking of Jewish themes and Jewish heroes, Jewish martyrs, and appropriating them for Christian use will continue unabated through Christian history. But another example about these same martyrs is also found in Rome in the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli. Some of you may know it because that's where Michelangelo's famous statue of Moses is, which we will talk about maybe I'm not talking about it here, but maybe next week. But in this case, that church apparently was early dedicated to, they had a cult for these Maccabean martyrs, and there is a 5th century Christian sarcophagus that was discovered there with little sections in it, divided into 7 sections. And then there in the late 19th century, they found 2 little lead plaques or silver plaques in them, which said that these 7 partitions had the remains, the relics of these martyrs, and they'd been translated, they'd been moved from the East and then found a home here in Rome, and then a whole cult dedicated to these martyrs grew up. Subsequently, in the early 20th century, these remains were actually examined closely, and one account I read, and I've been looking for verification of this, said they were just dog bones and other kinds of rubbish. And this is really not surprising because there was an active trade in saints' relics for many centuries in the early Middle Ages, and nobody had DNA testing. They weren't paleopathologists who could examine bones and know. So they took things on faith, literally took things on faith. And everyone wanted to have relics because it meant income as pilgrims would come and make donations. So you didn't want to question, you didn't want to look a gift horse in the mouth. This sarcophagus now is not really on view because it's been kind of demythologized, but it shows that these stories from the Jewish past continued to be strong in Christian Rome. And then a last example, this is also from Santa Maria Antiqua. It's from the mid-8th century, a series of frescoes that were done on the side walls. One wall, the one you see here, it does have Christ and doctors of the church down below, but the upper registers are all scenes from Genesis, from the Hebrew Bible, and the other side are scenes from the Christian New Testament. So it's a kind of parallelism, but we particularly can identify scenes from the life of Noah, and these are scenes from the life of Joseph. Now, I chose this one of Joseph being pulled out of the well because this could be interpreted by Christians to have a Christian message, which is as a foreshadowing of the resurrection of Christ, because there are many images of Christian images of Christ rising from his tomb, and they're not unlike this idea of the young Joseph. Here, I think he's being thrown into the well rather than being taken out, but visually there's that correspondence. We get this kind of conflation of Christian and Jewish thought and action, kind of the high point of it, and it's going to be very important because the influence really continues well up to Vatican II until today. In the writings and teachings of Pope Gregory the Great, who was the Pope, the Bishop of Rome from 590 to 604, and he's considered one of the great doctors of the church, and that's why you have these images of him, one from the Middle Ages and one from the late Renaissance. with the dove of the Holy Spirit sort of whispering in his ear, because that's clearly how he got his inspiration. Gregory was a Roman patrician. He'd grown up in Rome, and he I think his family lived on the Aventine, in fact, and he was apparently a great administrator, and he was a great thinker and writer. He tried to have a contemplative life, but he was dragged back into city administration, first to be a delegate, to be sent out as an emissary to the east, and then later to help run the city, and he became bishop. But Gregory, and you see him here on the left, with a figure of Job, the prophet Job, at his feet. And that, I think, is an indication of the suffering of Gregory's time. I mentioned wars and plagues, massive depopulation. The city probably had lost at least a third of its population. At that time, the population decrease would continue. But he was approached by Jews on several occasions, not Jews in Rome, but we have from Sicily and Sardinia and other places where there were Jewish communities, asking for his intervention from abusive Christian leaders, bishops and others, who were interfering with their right or their to practice religion. And Gregory very emphatically stepped in through a number of writings and pronouncements, and he put these in very specific terms, telling bishops what they couldn't do. But he also laid out basic principles that acknowledged that Christians really didn't like or want Jews, because the idea was that everyone should be Christian. But they also had to respect the liberties of Jews to practice their religion, because that's what Roman law allowed, and Christian law basically adapted Roman law. But out of this teaching, just as the Jews in their communities may not be allowed any liberties beyond the measure allotted to them by law, meaning let's not give them special treatment, so they must, on the other hand, suffer no violation of their rights. So if the law said you can't build new synagogues, okay, but you can't be closing down the existing synagogues. Jews have to have a place to pray. Or if the bishop says the synagogue is interfering with, and this was the case in Sardinia, with the practice of Christian worship, because they could hear the Jews praying from inside the church, then the Jews had to be allowed to find and supported in a different place to pray. You couldn't just close the synagogue altogether and leave them without a house of worship. So this kind of guarded tolerance and recognition of the rights for Jews to exist and pray within a Christian society became forcefully accepted by all of Gregory's successors, and really was the norm until the 13th century. So for many hundreds of years, Jews could understand that they were secondary citizens within a Christian culture. There were limits to what they could do, but they still had legal protections for religious practice and for other forms of assembly. And that would allow them in many different times and places to act very, to be more engaged in the society as a whole. The way Jews were treated differed greatly decade by decade and place to place. There was no general rule about Jewish life in the Middle Ages, except to say they were not as well off in the totality of things as their Christian neighbors. But there were many Jews who succeeded and were much better off than many Christians. And then there were many Jews who also were poor and suffering, just like everybody else. Now that's around 600, Gregory the Great. We don't have a lot of information about Jewish life in Rome between 600 and the 12th century, when we begin getting accounts of travelers and more documentation comes down to us. And one great source of one great source of information on the Jews of Rome and what Rome was like is from Benjamin of Tudela, who uh, uh, who visits the city uh, and and describes what he sees. He in the I'm blanking on the date. I want to say 1260, but or 1160. Um, Benjamin travels throughout the Mediterranean from Spain, and he records his journey. And this is one of the best accounts of life uh, in the early, what we call early High Middle Ages that we have. And he tracks Jewish communities because everywhere he goes, he's accepted in a Jewish community, and he can basically find a place to belong. But these people in the Jewish communities also become his guides and show him around. So he comes to Rome, and just to give you an idea how small the Jewish community was at the time, he he says there are 200 Jews in the city. Now, 200 Jews in the city, um, maybe there were 1,000. Maybe he's talking about men who could pray in the synagogue. But when you think that we talked about 50 or 60,000 Jews in the ancient city, we can see how things have changed in 1,000 years. Uh, Importantly, the city itself had decreased in size. So probably when um, when Benjamin came to Rome, the whole population of the city, of the Christian city, was only maybe 30,000. We really don't know, uh, because nobody was doing that kind of a census. So did I say the year was 1166? I think is the year that Benjamin comes, and but we know that populations were quite small. There'd been a total collapse across Italy in what was we still call sometimes the Dark Ages, but in those centuries, the 8th, 9th, 10th century. Um, so he found a city that was depopulated. It was a big city because it was still encased in the Aurelian walls, the 3rd century Roman walls, but most of the city had been abandoned because the aqueducts had been broken, so there was no water to bring to quench the thirst of citizens, and most of the population had settled down by the river, by the Tiber River. He also found big ruins everywhere of ancient buildings, some of which still could be described in some sense of what they were originally built for, could be understood. But also, after many centuries, most of the original purpose had been forgotten, and these buildings now became subject to storytelling, myths, legends, and the like. And clearly, his guide, whoever's taking him around, is telling him a lot of things, and he's writing them down or remembering him. So we can't take Benjamin as an authoritative um, source, but he is a source of what people were talking about and what people were saying at that time. So he's passing on the legends that he was aware of. So there are 80 palaces belonging to 80 kings who lived there, each called imperator, from King Tarquin down to Nero. Well, some of this is true. There were lots of palaces, and there were probably still ruins all over the Aventine, the Esquiline, the Caelian, um, and certainly, from uh, ancient sources that were still being written and talked about in the Middle Ages. They knew there were many, many kings. So why not put each king in his own palace? Um, and he goes on with a lot of this stuff, but we can make some correlations. And he talks about the Colosseum, which definitely was very visible at the time, and we mentioned that last week. And this is a slightly later coin from Louis of Bavaria, but the Colosseum is shown here as the center point of Christian Rome, and a few other Roman monuments, the Castel Sant'Angelo, which was the mausoleum of Hadrian, and one of the columns, either of Trajan or of was it Antoninus Pius? I forget the Antonine column at Piazza Colonna. But he also talks about underground catacombs. He has stories related to them, but he may have been seeing Christian or Jewish catacombs that were known at the time. So I think the ones in the Nomentana and the Vigna Randinini were probably lost, but it's possible the Monteverdi catacomb was still known, because he says there's also a cave in a hill on one bank of the river Tiber where are the graves of the 10 martyrs. Now, that could be the Monteverdi catacomb, which was on the Trastevere side of the Tiber, and did overlook the river. And importantly, he mentions the 10 martyrs, and this links it to Jewish tradition and not pagan or Christian tradition, because the story they're various stories, but they're of the 10 rabbis, 10 Jewish martyrs who were killed in ancient Rome. And even though in the Talmud they say they were killed at different times, popular legend, and there was a poem about this that circulated, had them all killed at the same time. So he has them buried, just like Christian martyrs, he has them buried in this catacomb. So it'd be nice if he actually did see the Monteverdi catacomb, because nobody saw it, nobody reports on it again until 1602, and then it was totally destroyed in the 19th century. So it's lost to us today. He also goes to the Lateran, which is the church and palace of the Pope, and he reports on some of the ancient things that are still there. He mentions 2 bronze columns that came from the temple in Jerusalem, and we don't have these bronze columns anymore, but they might be linked to the legends of the spiral columns that I mentioned last time when we saw this illustration of Pompey desecrating the temple in Jerusalem in 63 BCE. And these columns relate to a series of columns that were in St. Peter's Church at the time of Benjamin's visit, and they were used to decorate the tomb, the altar and the tomb of St. Peter. And the legend had it that they came from the Temple of Solomon. So in the Middle Ages, it was believed that these columns, which are now incorporated in these little shrines in the piers of the new St. Peter's, the one built in the 16th century by Bramante and Michelangelo and others, that people believed, and that these came from Jerusalem. They actually probably came from Dalmatia, from some other Hellenistic site, but that's what we know through modern art history and archaeology, and not what people believed back then. And this shot is nice, and actually I took it from a Flickr account. It's not my own photo, but it shows how Bernini then models the big columns for his baldacchino in St. Peter's from the 1600s, how he models his columns on those ancient ones. So there's a mix of real people. Benjamin of Tudela sees there are 200 Jews, and he meets a lot of them, and he mentions names of some of them, who we'll get to in a minute, some writers and some who work at the Vatican, not at the Vatican, but work for the Pope in the apostolic kind of court. And then he mentions legends, the legends of the Jewish martyrs and legends of pagan legends. And then there are a few instances where we can really tie his observations to what we can see today. He says, in front of St. John the Lateran, there are statues of Samson in marble. Well, we don't have that anymore. And Absalom, the son of King David, we don't know what those statues might have been. They probably weren't Samson and King David and Absalom. They were probably some ancient, some classical figures. But then he says there's a statue of Constantine the Great, and it's in bronze with a horse, and it's overlaid with gold. And this is certainly the statue of Marcus Aurelius, which stood at the Vatican until Michelangelo moved it to the Capitol when he redesigned the Capitol in the 1500s. And here we see a drawing by Martin van Heemskirk from the 16th century before it was moved. And here's a photo that I took a few weeks ago when I was in Rome, not thinking I would use it in this lecture, but and there is Marcus Aurelius. He's been moved into the Capitoline Museum, and a replica is now out on the piazza. But we now know, because of the cleaning that was done not too many years ago, that he was covered with gold, and we can see the gold on his arms and on his back and in his face. So in this Benjamin of Tudela is accurate. Okay, since we've got people on horseback, let's look at another emperor. This is the German Emperor Henry VII. And here's a picture of his entry into Rome in 1341 to be crowned a Holy Roman Emperor. The popes at this time were not in the city. They had absconded. They'd gone off to Avignon at the beginning of the 1300s, but the civic leadership welcomed Henry. And as was the custom for centuries, the Jews of Rome greeted him as part of his procession to his coronation. And this is a German drawing, so it's showing Jews greeting Henry wearing the kinds of funny hats that they were required to wear and probably were enforced, a rule that was probably more enforced in Germany than in Italy. But they are meant to be Roman Jews, and they are presenting Henry with a scroll of the Torah. Now, we know this was customary for both processions where the Pope would take possession of the city when he was named Bishop of Rome, and the Jews would greet him, and he would say he accepts the law, but he doesn't condone it. So he will take their offering, but he doesn't approve of it. But it's a kind of ritual pact that the Jews had century after century with the popes, which acknowledged their subservient position and their obedience to the Pope as their overlord, but he also recognized that they had their own law. And we'll get into this a little bit more next week, even though I want to, because it has something to do with the creation of the ghetto, what Jews were forced to do by the popes in return for having some level of acceptance. And sometimes what was required was strictly monetary, paying large amounts of money, and sometimes it was actually essentially physical abuse, public humiliation. And this happens sometimes, and then it doesn't happen, and it usually reflects the particular thinking of the Pope who's in office. So they continue to work within that framework set up by Gregory around 600, but they can interpret it different ways that they want. All right, so here's the city of Rome, a medieval view on the left, just showing lots of monuments, but it's important to realize that the city wasn't just a bunch of isolated monuments, particularly in the area down by the river. And this is the Tiber Island, and this is where the ghetto would be established in the 1500s. The urban tissue was very, very dense. Houses jostled one another. There were alleyways. People built streets to go around hunks of ruin that had been sitting there for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the streets weren't straight, they were crooked. People would have passageways under buildings and passageways over buildings. It was much more like a Middle Eastern souk than the type of modern Western city that we think of today. This is the first good map that we have of Rome from 1551, and we'll come back to it. But this is the area where Jews lived heavily in the early 1500s, and from about the 1200s or 1300s, before the institution of the ghetto. But this is the area where the ghetto would be created. But Jews started in antiquity across the river in Trastevere, and then they begin to migrate this way. But actually, they continue to live in all of these neighborhoods, and they're spread out in different areas. So let's take a look at the physical city where they lived and what traces still survive. We have nothing from the early Middle Ages, but we begin to find a few traces from the 11th, 12th, 13th century. I imagine a lot of you have been to Rome, so you've probably been on the Tiber Island. This is known as the Ponte Quattro Capi, named after this sculpture. There are two sculptures with four heads. They're sort of Janus figures looking forward and looking backward, very typical for bridges. And this is the oldest bridge standing in Rome, and it was built in 62 BCE, and it connects the mainland with the island. The island was a medical establishment. A temple of Asclepius was there, and there still is a hospital, which you see behind us. This is a picture from the 1980s that I took when the river was very, very high. And I show it to you because the Jews lived close to the river on both sides of the Tiber and on the island. And wherever they lived, and for most of their existence until the 1870s and 80s, when the ghetto was torn down and embankments were made along the Tiber, and what you see there today in the new Tempio Maggiore was built. Jews were always in an area that was susceptible to flooding, and almost every year the ghetto would flood, and much of Rome would flood. In antiquity, rich people lived up on the hills, the Esquiline, the Caelian. That's where Caesar and that's where Cicero, all those people lived. And the poor people lived down by the river because it wasn't healthy. But later on in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, pretty much everyone had to live down by the river because that was the primary source of water. Okay, there's my alarm going off. So we know there were a number of synagogues. We have references in documents, but we have no physical evidence, except for this one little building in Trastevere on the Vicolo dell'Atleta, which is believed to have been one of the synagogues, because there's a little Hebrew inscription on the column on the second level that says Natan Chai. We don't know who this Natan was. We don't know anything more about the building. This is what it looks like today. Inside, it might have looked a little like this. This is a manuscript illustration from the 15th century from northern Italy, and it shows us a little prayer house, a prayer room in an upper story of a house. Leo the 10th, the Medici Pope in the early 1500s, allowed there to be 11 synagogues in Rome at that time. And here's a statue of him at the Archaeology. And so we have a number of names. We have more than 11, but it's possible that not all of these existed at the same time, that one replaced another. We know that there was a big fire that destroyed one of the synagogues in Trastevere. We know that other ones closed and merged. So we think before the ghetto, there were 11 synagogues. The Jews did have a cemetery. It was outside the walls, and it was in Trastevere. This was recently rediscovered. Parts of it was rediscovered and excavated because an insurance building was being built there, known as the Campo Judeo, or the Orte, the Garden of the Jews, Field of the Jews. These remains have all been removed to the Jewish cemetery today. These excavations are just a few years old. This is the 1748 map of the city by Giambattista Noli, and we can see very clearly it's written Ortaccio degli Ebrei, and this is Porta Portese right here. So if any of you have been to Rome and gone to the flea market takes place right over the area of the medieval Jewish cemetery and much, much beyond. But this was all disturbed in the 1600s. I'll talk about that next week, when new walls were built by Pope Urban VIII. To give you a sense of the relationship, here's Porta Portese, there's the Tiber Island, and it's only about a 15-minute walk distance-wise. We had some powerful Jewish families. The Pierleone were the most famous. Baruch the Jew became Benedict the Christian, and he took the name Leo because Pope Leo was actually the one who baptized him. He was the biggest financier of the papacy in the 11th century, and then his family became extremely powerful. His son was a cardinal. His grandson actually became pope. but later was declared an anti-pope, but he was much loved in Rome, Pope Anacletus II. So the Pierleone family had towers and houses in this area that had been Jewish, but it wasn't entirely Jewish. And these are possibly two Pierleone strongholds, this one on the Tiber Island, and this one just at the base of the Aventine. And they also controlled for a time the theater of Marcellus, which is right on the edge of the later Ghetto, which we'll see next week, and right by the fish market, and later became the stronghold of the Orsini family. And that's what it looks like today on the lower left. Pierleone, it's interesting. We don't have the tombs of most medieval popes. A lot of things have been destroyed, but we have the sarcophagus surviving of Pietro Leone. And this is in the cloister of St. Paul's outside the walls. And it's a classical sarcophagus that's been reused. And the inscription on it says, in which I'm translating, "May Peter and Paul, to whom you were so faithful, protect you, Peter, son of Leo, and welcome your soul into the glory of heaven." So this is the son of the guy who converted, although he might have also converted too when he was just a child. And this is what it looks like today, and that's where the inscription is. It's a reworked ancient one. Now, what did Jews do? And we'll finish up with this point. They occupied a lot of professional niches. Yes, they were moneylenders, they were bankers, there were a few of them, but they also were tailors and shoemakers and street cleaners, and they did a whole range of things. We know mostly about their professions, just occasional notes in notarial documents selling about businesses and the like, and also inventories of properties. And for instance, this is a reconstruction of Old St. Peter's, but we know that in the atrium there were all sorts of shops and stalls, and there was a Jewish bookseller there in the early 1400s. So Jewish books were a big deal, but he was probably selling Christian books too. And I'll put this off till next week because of time, but there is this great tradition of Jewish writers and thinkers in late medieval Rome, particularly in the late 13th and early 14th century. The most famous of them is Emmanuel of Rome, and he was a contemporary of Dante, and his famous book, the Machberot, which is a book of stories that have poems embedded, and it's biographical and autobiographical and historical and philosophical and pedagogical. It's seen as a kind of precursor to Boccaccio's Decameron. He mostly wrote in Hebrew, but he was multilingual, and he also wrote in Italian. So I'm just going to end with this one little poem translated by Isabel Levi, because Emmanuel of Rome, most of his work, he was prolific, has not been translated out of Hebrew, but increasingly international scholars are looking at his work and making it better known. So this is translated from Italian, because he also wrote in the Italian vernacular, and it's not a typical poem, but I think it is fun. He says, I don't know who I am. Everyone listen. My very being is Ghibelline, meaning supporting the emperor. I'm in Rome, though. I'm for the Colonnas and the Orsinis. I'm happy when they're praised. That's the Ghibellines. They were against the Pope. And in Tuscany, may the Guelphs win. They're the papal party. In Romagna, I am what Zapatino is. I'm a bad Jew, but I'm not a Saracen, and I don't want to follow the Christians. I would, however, like to observe a part of each religion's laws. Of the Christians, the drinking and eating, and like good Moses, I'll only fast occasionally, and like precious Mohammed, I'll go for lechery, because that was believed at the time that the Muslims were very lecherous, since from the belt down, that one doesn't follow any faith. So he wrote a lot of religious texts, and many of his works are still used in the Roman Jewish prayer book, but he also thought very secularly too. He was an inquiring mind and one of the great polymaths of his day. And like Dante, he could be considered sort of the Jewish Dante of the 14th century. So I'm going to stop here, and we'll pick up next week with a few more things. And we'll talk about the idea of separation of Jews and Christians, particularly promulgated beginning in 1215 by Pope Innocent III in the Fourth Lateran Council, but that's going to lay the foundation for the Ghetto in the 1500s. So because of time, we'll address that in the next session. So I'm going to stop sharing and
thank you. And yes, I'm just going to jump directly into questions. One goes to one of the first things we mentioned, and then we'll go chronologically. So there was a question about this idea of cultural appropriation, whereas since Christians see the Tanakh, the Old Testament, as part of the story, why refer to it as cultural appropriation if they think it's also part of theirs?
well, I just use that term because it's one that's kicked around today. I think all of human history is cultural appropriation. Where would we be if we didn't learn and absorb and adapt? But in some ways, if you look at the way Christians at certain times in the Middle Ages address Jewish themes, it's sort of like Americans addressing Native American themes, and stereotyping and seeing only the past and not the present, and just it's picking and choosing. Uh, but Christians were omnivorous in their cultural appropriation because they adapted everything from the ancient world, of course, as well. If there was a woodland nymph or a cult of a stream why expunge that? Why not just sanctify it? And many of our early saints we know are just converted spirits and gods of the ancient world. There was a great book written almost 100 years ago by Arthur Darby Knock called Conversion. I remember reading that in college, and it just opened my eyes to how things are. They seem to be changed, but they're not. There's a church near Paestum in Rome where the statue of the Madonna is actually an ancient statue repurposed, an ancient statue of the goddess Hera that's been repurposed. So yeah, this is what culture is, and I think that's what makes history interesting to study. Jews do it too. Jews were borrowing heavily from Christianity in so many ways, in what they wrote, in the art they made, in rituals, in even ceremonial objects are often adapted from Christian forms. So it's a constant conversation of cultures.
Thank you. Another question is there in the Vatican any records of Jewish history, and do we have access if there is?
Well, the Vatican has church records, although, at different times they've been destroyed. The city's been sacked, things have burned. So much of what we know about Jews in the Middle Ages comes from church records. So when Jews are mentioned, so we know when a pope has a bull, has a kind of statement about Jews, we don't usually have documents with the Jewish reaction. We don't really get pretty extensive Jewish archives, notarial archives, ironically, or actually it's because of when the ghetto is established and there's a consolidation. So the historian Kenneth Stowe has done marvelous work studying all the notarial documents and a lot of other contracts and other kinds of work that were Jews for Jews in the Jewish archives. But for the Middle Ages, not so much. We mostly have religious texts. We don't have historical works. And to know about the paucity of Jewish historical sources, Joseph Yerushalmi's classic book, Zachor, is still the best place to start. Although we do know there were more Jews writing history now than I think he was aware of 30 or 40 or 50 years ago when he wrote that book. But still, it's just not what Jews did. Jews didn't, the intellectual Jews, the religious Jews, did not care about modern history, the progression today. They were thinking about biblical times and messianic times, and those were the key points in their calendar.
Thank you. You briefly showed an image of an Italian synagogue, and there was a question about the way the synagogue inside was structured. Is it what we know more from Ashkenazi synagogues, or because the one you showed was not church-like in a way? Do we know of anything of the synagogues at that time and how they were structured?
Oh, we do know a little bit. I've actually written an article or two, and they're online. I can give Cheryl the sources. But most of the synagogues, it's interesting. We have no medieval descriptions and very few later descriptions by Jews of synagogues, except one letter by an Italian rabbi, Obadiah di Bartonoro, who describes the synagogue in Palermo, which is very, very lavish. So it's a medieval synagogue, and he's writing in the 1400s, I believe. But for the most part, we only have a little bit of physical evidence, and then occasionally we have these manuscript illuminations like the one I showed you. So that's clearly it's probably a private house, and they have a space upstairs. And that's in the 15th century when Jews had left Rome and a lot of other places for the most part, and they've dispersed, and I'll talk about this next week, to towns all through northern Italy, where the communities are very small. It's usually one or two families, a family meaning a merchant or a banker or a doctor and their servants and retainers and children. So it might be enough for a minyan, but it's not a very big community. And they're usually renting a house, or they've been given a house by the authorities, and then they turn it into a prayer place. So it's benches, it's tables. You saw there was an ark. It could have been a repurposed wardrobe. We don't know. And that would have been very normal in Italy. And there are still places you can visit like that. In Germany, we had little hall churches, but there weren't big synagogues. What you see in Prague, or what was in, that's unusual. But some of the big cities in Central Europe in the 12th, 13th century began to have large enough populations and enough legal rights to build, something substantial.
Okay, I'm going to slip in a last question. How much were the Jews of Rome different or similar to the Jews in the rest of Italy in terms of their life and how it was run? Can we kind of deduce from the Jews of Rome about the rest, or was it a separate type of community?
Well, the Romans would always say they were separate, they were unique, but we know that they were always susceptible to influxes of immigrant groups. And next week, we'll talk about the big influx coming in from Spain after the expulsions of 1492, and from South Italy from the expulsions in the early 1500s, which more than doubles the size of the Roman Jewish population. And partly that huge population expansion is what exacerbates tensions and is one of the factors, not the main factor, but it's certainly one of the factors that leads the anti-Jewish forces in the church to push for their isolation and separation. There are just too many Jews. When there are only 200, nobody cares. But when suddenly you have a big explosion of population, it becomes more important. There was always interaction between Jewish populations. There was a lot of coming and going. We talked last week about scholars from the Holy Land coming to Rome. This continued. Jews were, let's use the word cosmopolitan, but in the positive sense, not in the negative. They spoke a common language, or at least they read a common language, so they could communicate, they could write, they could, and they had merchant communities throughout the Mediterranean. So there was linkages. I think Rome was on the edge of some of this. We don't get that many mentions of Rome, like in the Cairo Geniza. It's mostly, Baghdad and Alexandria and Spain and southern Italy, but Rome was sort of on the periphery. But I mean, there were connections, but they did have their own rite, a minchag, which they still have today, and consequently, as we'll see with the ghetto, they're only allowed one synagogue building, but they have 5 congregations created in that building, the Cinque Scuole, and each one represents a different community from a different place that has its own rituals and prayers. So that's there's a lot alike and a lot different. But even if you go to services in Rome today, certainly as an Ashkenazi American Jew or as an Israeli, you will find many things that you are not familiar with. But
Okay, one last question.
That said, for many of the communities around the Mediterranean.
I just got too many good questions to not ask them, so I'll ask this last one. Last week we saw the inscriptions were all, none of them were in Hebrew. You mentioned there wasn't Hebrew, and there was a question if in this period there was any shift in the place of Hebrew within the community.
Yes, a very good question, a very good question. And I should have mentioned, we have no inscriptions from the cemeteries that I showed that won out by Porta Portese. We have the cemetery in Venosa in southern Italy, and from the 8th, 9th century, and we see there Hebrew coming back. And then we know in Apulia, we have these very learned communities in Trani, Otranto, places like that, and they are writing in Hebrew. They are creating Hebrew books. They're big centers of rabbinic studies and learning. This does come to Rome. This does impact in Rome. And we have a family, the Anal family, which produces rabbis and scholars. We have people like Emmanuel of Rome. We have another guy, Judah of Rome, who might be his brother or cousin. And they're all writing in Hebrew. They've got Hebrew. They've got Hebrew. They don't speak it probably, but they're writing Hebrew. But much of their Hebrew probably comes via Spain, where Hebrew poetry, Hebrew writing, Hebrew philosophy, Hebrew commentary of the Bible remains strong. And there's a big communication between these two places. This is not my area of great specialty, but I can say that, yes, in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, there's a lot of Hebrew. And then interesting, that will help foment the Italian Renaissance because Christian scholars are coming to Jews to learn Hebrew, and also Jews are acting as the primary translators from Arabic to Hebrew to Latin, and from Greek to Hebrew to Latin as well. So very important role.
Okay, fascinating. Thanks. Thank you so much. It was amazing.
Okay, see you next week, everybody. We do the Ghetto. Again, so much material, but I'm going to give Cheryl, there's a book out that came from the Centro Primo Levi in New York of translations of Emmanuel of Rome's sonnets. It's bilingual for those of you who read Hebrew, so I recommend it. And there are a few other interesting things dealing with some of these questions that you can look at as well.
Perfect. So we'll be sending all of that in the follow-up email. Looking forward to seeing you next week. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day, afternoon, evening, or night, wherever you are. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.